Margaret Ellis had buried her husband on a rain-soaked Thursday in October, the kind of gray day that seemed arranged by the universe itself. 6 months later, on a clear April afternoon scented with thawing earth and gasoline, she saw him alive between the dairy aisle and the frozen food section of a suburban supermarket 30 miles from the cemetery where his name was carved in granite. For half a year she had learned the mechanics of widowhood: how to sleep diagonally across a bed that felt too large, how to sort mail addressed to a man who no longer existed, how to smile politely when neighbors said she was so strong. She had practiced breathing through the mornings when the kitchen was silent and no one argued about the news. She had even grown accustomed to the absence of Daniel's shoes by the door. What she had not prepared for was the sound of his laugh drifting across polished tile. She had been reaching for a carton of milk when she heard it, low and slightly uneven, the tail and always softer than the beginning. It was a laugh she could have identified in a crowded stadium. Margaret's fingers tightened around the carton until it dented. She did not turn immediately. Something inside her resisted the possibility, as if looking too soon might shatter whatever fragile structure kept her upright. Then she heard him speak, complaining about the price of butter in the exact tone she had endured for 42 years. That was when she turned. 3 aisles over stood a man with Daniel's broad back, Daniel's posture, Daniel's habit of squinting at labels as though deciphering secret codes hidden in ingredient lists. His hair, once dark, had been fully claimed by silver, and it lay stubbornly flat except for the familiar ridge that refused to behave. Even the faint scar along his jaw, earned decades earlier in a fishing accident, was visible when he tilted his head toward the fluorescent light. Margaret did not gasp. She simply stared, her mind struggling to reconcile marble and heartbeat, coffin and grocery basket. The milk slipped from her hand and burst against the floor. Shoppers turned. A clerk hurried forward with paper towels. Margaret stepped away from the spreading white pool, as though it were something sacred she had spilled. She moved toward him slowly, aware of the unnatural rhythm of her pulse. "Daniel," she said, her voice thinner than she intended. He turned. His eyes, blue with a fleck of gray near the left pupil, met hers without recognition. He regarded her with polite confusion, the way one might study a stranger who has mistaken you for someone else at a train station. "I'm sorry," he replied. The voice was identical, textured with age, but steady. "Daniel, it's me," she continued, ignoring the curious stares around them. "It's Margaret." A brief shadow crossed his expression, too fleeting to name, and then it was gone. "Ma'am, my name is Andrew," he said carefully. "I think you've confused me with someone else." The words felt rehearsed, not hurried, not defensive, simply prepared. Margaret stepped closer. She could see the tiny crease above his right eyebrow that deepened when he was irritated. She had traced that crease countless times. "Show me your left hand," she said abruptly. The request startled him, but after a second's hesitation he lifted it, perhaps to prove the absurdity of her insistence. His ring finger bore a faint indentation where a wedding band had once rested, and his little finger curved slightly inward, crooked from a childhood fracture he used to joke about during family dinners. The sight of it made her knees weak. "Please," he said softly, lowering his hand. "You look unwell." That softness, the specific cadence of concern, was more convincing than any scar. "You died," she whispered. "There was an accident on the highway. They told me you never regained consciousness." He glanced around, aware now of the attention gathering like static. "I don't know what you're going through," he replied, "but I'm not the man you think I am." He placed a brief, almost reflexive hand on her shoulder, a gesture so intimately familiar it stole the air from her lungs, then withdrew and turned away. Margaret did not follow him immediately. She stood frozen as he paid in cash at the register, folding the bills with the precise alignment Daniel had once insisted upon. He declined a receipt, slipped coins into his pocket without counting them, and exited into the parking lot. Something within her shifted from shock to decision. She left the broken milk behind and walked outside just in time to see him loading groceries into an aging blue sedan with a dented rear bumper. Daniel had owned a black SUV polished weekly with religious devotion. This car was modest, neglected. Still, Andrew, if that was his name, arranged the bags with practiced care. Canned goods first, fragile items last. Margaret memorized the license plate before she even realized she was doing it. She followed at a distance as he drove away from the shopping center and into neighborhoods she rarely visited. The houses grew smaller, lawns patchy but tended, porches decorated with wind chimes and faded flags. He turned onto a quiet street lined with maple trees just beginning to bud. Margaret parked half a block behind him. He exited the sedan and carried the grocery bags toward a pale yellow house with a narrow porch. Before he reached the door, it opened. A woman in her early 50s stepped out, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her hair was auburn, loosely tied back, and she smiled with unmistakable familiarity when she saw him. She leaned in and kissed his cheek. Margaret felt the world tilt. The woman took two of the bags from his arms as though this had been their routine for years. Then two children burst from the doorway, a boy perhaps 10, a girl slightly younger, shouting, "Grandpa." The word rang through Margaret like a bell struck too hard. The man laughed, bending slightly to steady the girl as she wrapped her arms around his waist. He handed the boy a carton of ice cream with theatrical secrecy. The woman rested her hand on his back in a gesture that carried intimacy not easily fabricated. Margaret watched them disappear inside. The door closed gently, sealing a scene so ordinary it felt obscene. She remained in her car long after the street returned to quiet. Birds moved between branches overhead. A dog barked somewhere down the block. Her reflection in the rear-view mirror looked older than she remembered. She did not cry at first. Instead, she examined the details, the ease of his movements, the comfort of his posture, the absence of hesitation when the children called him by a title he had never held in her presence. She lifted her phone and took photographs of the house, the license plate, the street sign. Her hands trembled only slightly. The sky shifted from afternoon blue to the pale gold of early evening before she finally started her engine and drove home. That night she sat at her dining room table beneath a single lamp, spreading out photo albums and comparing them to the images on her phone. The resemblance was not superficial, it was exact. The line of his jaw, the subtle asymmetry of his ears, the narrow white mark on his wrist from a long-healed burn. These were not features strangers shared by coincidence. She replayed the memory of the funeral, the closed casket, the murmured condolences, the explanation that the injuries from the crash were too severe for viewing. She had accepted that decision through tears, trusting the authorities and the signatures on the paperwork. Now doubt crept into every corner of that day. Who had she buried? Who had she mourned? And why was the man she loved living under another name in a modest house with children who called him grandfather? Margaret did not sleep. At dawn, she dialed her daughter, Caroline, who lived across town with her own young family. Caroline answered on the third ring, her voice thick with sleep. Margaret did not bother with pleasantries. "I saw your father yesterday," she said. Silence answered her at first, then a cautious sigh. "Mom," Caroline began gently, "we've talked about how grief can—" "I followed him," Margaret interrupted. "He lives in a yellow house on Briar Street. There's a woman, 2 children. They call him Grandpa." The firmness in her tone erased the softness from Caroline's reply. "Stay there," her daughter said at last. "I'm coming over." When the call ended, Margaret looked again at the photographs glowing on her phone. Whatever explanation awaited her, one truth was already clear. Death had not ended her marriage. It had only concealed something far more complicated. Caroline arrived within 40 minutes, still wearing yesterday's sweater thrown hastily over leggings, her hair pulled into a loose knot. She did not knock. She stepped into the house as if bracing herself for disaster and found her mother seated at the dining table, photographs spread in careful rows. The early light filtered through the curtains, revealing a face that looked drained but steady. Margaret did not appear hysterical. That unsettled Caroline more than tears would have. Without a word, Margaret handed her the phone. Caroline scrolled slowly. At first her brow furrowed in polite confusion, the kind reserved for optical illusions. Then she leaned closer. Her thumb paused over a photograph of the man stepping from the blue sedan. "That's," she began, but the sentence did not finish. She zoomed in on his profile, on the familiar curve of his shoulder beneath the jacket. Her breathing changed, shallow and uneven. "It looks like Dad," she whispered, though the phrasing felt weak even to her. "It is him," Margaret replied, her voice calm in a way that no longer belonged to grief. "I spoke to him. He said his name is Andrew." Caroline set the phone down carefully, as though it might burn her. "People can resemble each other," she said, though conviction was absent. "There are cases of—" "He has the scar on his wrist from when the grill exploded," Margaret interrupted. "And the crooked finger from when he fell off the barn roof at 15. Strangers do not share that history." The kitchen clock ticked loudly between them. Caroline pressed her palms against the table and closed her eyes briefly. "Did you see his body?" Margaret asked quietly. The question landed like a stone dropped into water. Caroline's eyes opened at once. "Mom, at the hospital. After the accident. Did you see him?" Margaret persisted. Caroline's lips parted, then pressed together again. "No," she admitted at last. "The doctors said it was too severe. They told us identification was confirmed through documents and dental records." Margaret nodded once, absorbing the words. The confirmation had always seemed bureaucratic, official enough to silence doubt. Now it felt like a curtain pulled too quickly across a stage. They drove together to Briar Street before noon. This time Margaret did not park half a block away. She stopped directly across from the yellow house, the engine idling. Caroline leaned forward in her seat, staring at the porch as if expecting it to vanish. After several minutes, the front door opened. The auburn-haired woman stepped out first, carrying a small laundry basket. Moments later the man followed, sleeves rolled up, holding a toolbox. Caroline's breath caught audibly. The resemblance was no longer filtered through photographs. It stood in daylight. The man bent to adjust something near the porch steps. Caroline watched the angle of his spine, the habitual tilt of his head when concentrating. Tears filled her eyes without permission. "That's Dad," she whispered, the denial dissolving. Margaret did not respond. She observed instead the way the woman handed him a glass of water, the casual brush of fingers that suggested years of routine. The children appeared soon after, racing into the yard. The boy kicked a ball toward him. He trapped it instinctively with the side of his foot, laughing when it rolled away. It was a sound Caroline had not heard since the funeral. She covered her mouth as if to contain it. "How?" she asked, her voice breaking. "How is this possible?" Margaret's gaze remained fixed on the house. "That is what we're going to find out," she said. They did not approach that day. Instead, they returned home and sat in the living room, the air heavy with questions neither could yet form properly. Caroline paced the carpet, running her hands through her hair. "If he's alive, then who was buried?" she murmured. The cemetery lay only a few miles away, the headstone polished and adorned with fresh flowers each month. Margaret had stood before it countless times, speaking into the wind as though it might carry her words downward. The idea that a stranger rested beneath that stone unsettled her in a way she could not articulate. "I want to go there," Margaret said suddenly. They drove to the cemetery in near silence. The grounds were quiet, trimmed lawns stretching in measured rows. Margaret walked with deliberate steps to the grave marked with Daniel Ellis's name. The dates carved into granite felt colder than the morning air. She stood before it, not with tears but with scrutiny. Caroline remained a few feet behind, uncertain whether to approach or give space. "This says he died," Margaret said softly, touching the engraved year. "But I saw him breathe." Caroline swallowed. "We could request exhumation," she offered hesitantly. The words sounded clinical, heavy with procedure. Margaret considered it. Imagining the earth disturbed, the coffin lifted. "Not yet," she replied. "First we need proof of what is happening now." Her tone carried a clarity that surprised even her. The grief that had once clouded her decisions had thinned into something sharper. That evening, Margaret reviewed old documents from the accident. Police reports, insurance papers, hospital summaries, all filed neatly in a drawer she had avoided opening for months. Caroline sat beside her, reading line by line. The accident description felt sterile: a late-night collision on a remote stretch of highway, a vehicle engulfed in flames, identification confirmed through a wallet recovered near the driver's seat. Margaret frowned. "He never carried his wallet in the car," she said slowly. "He always kept it in his jacket pocket." Caroline looked up. "Are you sure?" Margaret nodded. "He was paranoid about losing it. He said leaving it in the car was asking for trouble." The report mentioned severe burns that prevented visual confirmation. Dental records had been matched, but Margaret remembered Daniel postponing his last dental appointment due to travel. Had records been recent? Or convenient? Caroline's phone buzzed suddenly. She glanced at the screen and stiffened. "It's Uncle Robert," she said. Robert had handled much of the funeral coordination while Margaret had been too distraught to function. Caroline answered hesitantly. Margaret watched her daughter's face shift from guarded to alarmed within seconds. "When?" Caroline asked sharply. "Who authorized that?" She listened for a moment longer, then ended the call. "What is it?" Margaret demanded. Caroline lowered the phone slowly. "Uncle Robert said something strange happened after the accident. Dad called him 2 days before the crash. Asked him if he would make sure you didn't view the body if anything ever happened. Robert thought it was morbid, a joke." The room seemed to shrink. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. "Why would he say that?" she asked, though part of her already sensed the answer. Caroline shook her head, overwhelmed. "There's more." Robert said the insurance claim was unusually quick. "No disputes, no dilas." He said he always thought it was odd, but he assumed the company just processed it efficiently. Margaret leaned back in her chair. Threads were beginning to connect, forming a pattern she did not yet fully grasp but could no longer ignore. Night fell around them as they pieced together fragments of memory. Daniel's increased travel over the last decade. Unexplained withdrawals from joint accounts. Occasional tension when Margaret asked about finances. None of it had seemed catastrophic at the time. Marriages accumulated secrets like dust, unnoticed until sunlight revealed them. Now each detail glowed with new significance. "I don't want to believe he would do something like this," Caroline said quietly. "But if he did, why?" Margaret stared at the documents spread before her. "People don't disappear without a reason," she replied. "If he staged his death, it was deliberate." The question that lingered between them was not only how, but who else knew. Caroline hesitated before speaking again. "There's something else," she admitted, her voice thin. "About a year ago, I saw a bank statement on Dad's desk with an account I didn't recognize. When I asked, he said it was business-related. I didn't push." Margaret looked up sharply. "Did you tell anyone?" "No. I thought it wasn't my place." Silence settled heavily once more. Outside, wind brushed against the windows, carrying the scent of rain. Margaret felt something inside her harden, not into bitterness, but into resolve. The man she had loved for 4 decades was either a victim of an elaborate deception or its architect. Either possibility demanded truth. "We're not imagining this," Margaret said firmly. "He is alive. And if he chose to abandon us, we will know why." Caroline nodded slowly, wiping her eyes. The shock of recognition had transformed into determination. They sat together late into the night, drafting questions, listing names of people connected to the accident, noting financial discrepancies. Grief had once left Margaret fragile. Now it fueled her clarity. The stone in the cemetery no longer symbolized loss alone. It symbolized a lie. As the clock crept past midnight, Margaret closed the folder of documents. "Tomorrow," she said, her voice steady, "we start digging." Margaret did not sleep that night. She lay awake listening to the unfamiliar rhythm of her own thoughts. Grief had once filled the darkness with sorrow. Now it filled it with calculation. By morning she had made a decision that surprised even her. This was no longer a matter for whispered speculation between mother and daughter. If Andrew, had constructed a second life, it had required planning, money, and silence from more than one person. Secrets of that size left trails. She dressed with unusual precision, choosing a navy coat and low heels she had not worn since before the funeral. Caroline arrived shortly after 8, carrying coffee and a notebook. There was no more discussion of whether the man on Briar Street was Daniel. That fact had settled into them both like a permanent weight. Now, the question was how. Their first stop was the insurance company that had processed the accident claims 6 months earlier. The building's lobby was glass and steel, impersonal and bright. Margaret approached the reception desk with quiet composure. She introduced herself not as a grieving widow, but as the policyholder requesting documentation review. Something in her tone, steady, controlled, prompted immediate professionalism. Within 30 minutes, they were seated across from a claims manager who shuffled through digital records on a tablet. "The payout was issued within 10 days, he explained. "All required documentation was provided promptly: death certificate, police report, coroner's confirmation." Margaret leaned forward. "Who submitted the documents?" The manager scanned the file. "Your husband's business partner, according to this." Caroline and Margaret exchanged a look. Daniel had owned a small logistics company with 2 long-term partners, men Margaret trusted without question. "Which one?" she asked evenly. The manager read the name. It was Samuel Turner. Margaret felt a faint tightening in her chest. Samuel had attended the funeral, had held her hand beside the closed casket. He had told her Daniel's final months were filled with stress over contracts and expansion plans. "Did you require visual confirmation?" she asked. The manager hesitated. "In cases involving severe trauma, identification can be confirmed through dental records and documentation provided by next of kin or business associates." Margaret absorbed that carefully worded answer. Dental records could be copied. Paperwork could be signed. If someone coordinated the timing, the system would not resist. They left with printed copies of everything legally accessible. Outside, Caroline exhaled slowly. "If Samuel was involved, that means this wasn't impulsive," she said. Margaret nodded.
No.
It was engineered. Their next stop was the police station in the district where the accident had occurred. The officer who met them appeared skeptical at first. 6 months had passed, and official records showed nothing unusual. Margaret requested to review the original accident photographs. After a pause and several internal calls, permission was granted for limited viewing. The images were clinical and disturbing: a burned vehicle crushed against a guardrail, smoke stains along the pavement, emergency lights flashing in frozen frames. Margaret forced herself to examine details. The car model matched Daniel's SUV. The license plate was visible in one shot, though partially obscured by soot. Caroline leaned closer. "Zoom in," she murmured. The officer adjusted the screen. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. One digit appeared slightly misaligned, as though the plate had been replaced or tampered with before impact. It was subtle, easy to miss, but once seen, impossible to ignore. Was the engine number verified? Margaret asked quietly. The officer frowned, scrolling. According to the report, the vehicle was heavily damaged. Identification relied primarily on plate confirmation and personal effects recovered at the scene. Personal effects. Margaret's thoughts raced. What personal effects? The officer read aloud. Wallet, driver's license, wedding ring. Caroline stiffened. Mom, Dad stopped wearing his ring 2 years ago, she whispered. Margaret nodded slowly. Daniel had claimed it irritated his finger during travel. The ring had remained in a dish by the sink at home. She had seen it the week before the accident. May I see the recovered items? Margaret asked. The officer explained they had been catalogued and transferred after the funeral. Some were returned to the family, others destroyed due to fire damage. Margaret recalled receiving a small envelope containing a charred key and fragments of metal she had assumed were part of the vehicle. She had never seen the wallet or the ring. At the time, she had been too overwhelmed to question the absence. Outside the station, Caroline's voice trembled. If the ring was at home, how did it end up in the report? Margaret stared ahead. It didn't, she replied. Someone placed it there. They drove next to Daniel's former business office. The building looked unchanged, glass doors, company logo polished and intact. Samuel Turner greeted them with visible discomfort. He had aged in 6 months, or perhaps Margaret simply saw him differently now. After polite condolences and strained pleasantries, Margaret addressed him directly. Did you submit Daniel's documents to the insurance company? She asked. Samuel hesitated only a fraction too long. I helped facilitate paperwork, yes, he admitted. You were in no condition to handle it. Where did you obtain his dental records? She continued. Samuel blinked. From the office, I believe. He kept copies. Caroline watched his hands. They trembled slightly against the desk. Margaret pressed further. Did you view the body? The question hung between them. Samuel looked down. It wasn't necessary, he said quietly. Identification was confirmed. Margaret felt certainty crystallize. You knew, she said, not loudly, but with finality. Samuel's face drained of color. I thought it was for the best, he muttered. He said it would prevent scandal. Protect the company. Caroline inhaled sharply. Protect it from what? Samuel closed his eyes briefly. From financial collapse, he confessed. Daniel had withdrawn substantial funds months before the accident. If creditors discovered it, we would have been ruined. Margaret's voice remained steady. Withdrawn to where? Samuel did not answer immediately. He said he was restructuring assets. He replied finally. I didn't ask questions I didn't want answered. The evasion was confession enough. Back in the car, Caroline's composure fractured. So, he drained the business before he died, she said. And Samuel helped cover it. Margaret nodded. It appears so. That evening, Margaret reviewed bank statements she had once ignored. Transfers from joint accounts into unfamiliar ones, subtle but consistent. Large sums moved weeks before the accident. She traced patterns late into the night, building a timeline. Daniel's supposed death occurred exactly 3 days after the final major transfer. The precision was chilling. Caroline sat beside her, anger replacing disbelief. He didn't just leave, she said. He prepared to disappear. Margaret felt no tears now, only clarity. The yellow house on Briar Street was not a spontaneous refuge. It was the destination of a carefully funded escape. The children calling him Grandpa were not an accident of resemblance. They were part of a life he had already established long before the crash. The accident itself had been a performance, supported by documentation, cooperation, and calculated trust. There's one more thing, Caroline said quietly. If he faked his death, Someone had to die in his place. The implications settled heavily between them. Margaret remembered the closed casket, the urgency with which officials had discouraged viewing. She imagined a stranger occupying the space meant for her husband. The thought no longer felt abstract, it felt plausible. Margaret closed the final folder and leaned back. The architecture of the lie was visible now. Financial withdrawals, complicit partners, manipulated documentation, staged tragedy. It had required courage of a particular kind, the kind rooted in selfishness. She wondered how long Daniel had rehearsed the narrative, how many nights he had sat across from her at dinner knowing he was preparing to vanish. Caroline placed a hand over her mother's. "What do we do next?" she asked. Margaret's gaze was steady. "We confirm the identity he's using now. We follow the money. And then we decide whether the law should be involved." For the first time since the supermarket, Margaret felt something resembling control. The shock had faded, replaced by method. Daniel had assumed she would remain suspended in mourning, too fragile to question inconsistencies. He had underestimated the transformation grief could forge. As midnight approached, Margaret stepped onto her porch and looked at the quiet street. Somewhere across town, a man who once shared her bed believed his past was buried beneath stone. He believed documentation protected him. He believed time would soften suspicion. He was wrong. Margaret waited 3 days before making her next move. Not because she doubted what she had uncovered, but because she wanted her thoughts to settle into precision rather than fury. Anger could be dismissed. Evidence could not. Caroline checked in constantly, sometimes stopping by with groceries Margaret did not need, sometimes simply sitting in silence beside her. The house no longer felt haunted. It felt observant, as if walls that once absorbed sorrow were now witnessing strategy. On the 4th morning, Margaret made an appointment with an attorney specializing in financial crimes and identity fraud. The office was located in a restored brick building downtown, its polished wood floors contrasting sharply with the sterile environments she had visited earlier in the week. The attorney, Laura Bennett, listened without interruption as Margaret laid out the timeline. The accident, the closed casket, the rapid insurance payout, the withdrawn funds, the man living under another name on Briar Street. Margaret spoke not as a victim, but as a witness presenting facts. When she finished, Laura leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled. "If everything you're describing is accurate," Laura said evenly, "this constitutes fraud on multiple levels. Insurance fraud, identity falsification, potential conspiracy. And if another deceased individual was misidentified intentionally, that raises even more serious criminal concerns." Margaret did not flinch. "What would you need to proceed?" "Documentation of financial transfers," Laura replied. "Proof that your husband is operating under a false identity. Confirmation that the reported death was staged. Ideally, statements from anyone involved." Margaret thought of Samuel Turner's trembling hands. "I believe one of his business partners knows more than he admitted," she said. Laura nodded. "Then we apply pressure." By afternoon, formal requests for financial subpoenas were in motion. Margaret authorized access to joint accounts she had never scrutinized before. Caroline accompanied her, not as a grieving daughter, but as an ally. Watching her mother navigate legal language with calm authority shifted something between them. Roles blurred, respect deepened. 2 days later, preliminary findings arrived. Bank records revealed a series of transfers totaling nearly $1.8 million into accounts opened under the name Andrew Whitaker, an identity established 3 years prior to the accident. The funds had been routed through shell entities connected loosely to Daniel's logistics company. Margaret studied the statements in silence. The betrayal was no longer emotional, it was structural. "He didn't panic," Caroline murmured. "He planned." Laura arranged a private meeting with Samuel Turner under the guise of clarifying accounting discrepancies. Margaret insisted on attending. When Samuel entered the conference room and saw her seated beside the attorney, color drained from his face. "I'm not here for dramatics," Margaret began calmly. "I'm here for the truth." Samuel avoided her eyes. Laura placed printed bank transfers on the table. "We have documentation linking company assets to accounts under the name Andrew Whitaker," she said. "We also have evidence that Mr. Ellis assisted in filing insurance claims following a fatal accident that may not have been fatal." Samuel's composure cracked. "I didn't know everything," he said quickly. "He told me he was restructuring before retirement. He said the accident was an opportunity." "An opportunity for what?" Margaret asked. "To leave," Samuel admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "He said he had another life he wanted to commit to. He was tired of dividing himself." The bluntness stunned even Caroline. "So you helped him fake his death?" she demanded. "I helped process paperwork," Samuel corrected weakly. "He said the vehicle would be unrecognizable, that identification would be straightforward." Margaret leaned forward. "Whose body was in that car?" Samuel swallowed hard. "A man from out of state. Terminally ill. No close family. Daniel paid someone connected to him. I didn't ask for names." The room felt airless. Margaret absorbed the information without visible reaction. She had suspected as much, but hearing it spoken aloud solidified the horror. "You stood beside me at his funeral," she said quietly. "You watched me grieve." Samuel closed his eyes. "I thought time would soften it," he muttered. "He said you would recover financially, that it would be kinder than divorce." The word kinder echoed bitterly. Margaret stood. "Kindness does not require deception," she said. "It requires courage." Within hours, Laura filed a comprehensive report with the district attorney's office, attaching bank records, signed statements, and documentation inconsistencies. The case moved faster than Margaret expected. Fraud involving large sums and falsified death certificates triggered immediate attention. The following morning, authorities executed warrants at the Briar Street residence and the former logistics office. Margaret did not witness the arrests, but she received confirmation through Laura's call. "He was cooperative," Laura said. "So was the woman at the house. She claimed she believed he was widowed." Margaret felt a brief, unexpected pang, not for Daniel, but for the woman whose reality had just collapsed. "And Samuel?" "He's agreed to testify in exchange for leniency." By afternoon, news outlets began reporting on a suspected staged death scheme involving local businessman. Margaret ignored the calls from reporters. She was not interested in spectacle. Caroline arrived shortly after sunset. "They took him from the house in front of the children," she said quietly. "Neighbors were outside." Margaret nodded. Consequences rarely arrived gently. 2 days later, she chose to confront him, not in anger, but in finality. The detention facility allowed limited visitation. When Daniel entered the room in a standard-issued uniform, he looked smaller than she remembered, as if the architecture of his deception had been supporting his stature all along. He stopped several feet from the table. "Margaret," he said softly. She regarded him steadily. "Your name is Daniel Ellis," she replied. "Not Andrew Whitaker." He exhaled slowly, a sound of resignation rather than denial. "I didn't want to hurt you." "You orchestrated my mourning," she said. "You arranged for me to bury a stranger." He lowered his gaze. "I thought if I disappeared cleanly, you'd be financially secure. There wouldn't be a messy divorce. No public embarrassment." "You underestimated me," she said, "and you overestimated your ability to control consequences." For a moment, silence lingered between them, heavy with decades of shared history now fractured beyond repair. "Was any of it real?" he asked quietly. "It was real to me," Margaret answered. "That is why this matters." She stood before emotion could intrude. "The law will decide the rest." As she exited the facility, she felt no triumph, only closure beginning to take shape. The man she once loved was now defined by affidavits and court dates. Whatever affection remained had been replaced by clarity. In the weeks that followed, charges were formalized: insurance fraud, identity falsification, conspiracy, financial misappropriation. The assets transferred under false names were frozen. Investigations into the deceased substitute's identity expanded. Margaret cooperated fully, providing statements with calm precision. At home, she removed Daniel's remaining belongings from the attic. Not in fury, but in acknowledgement. The past had been rewritten. She would not live inside it. One evening, as autumn approached again, Caroline sat beside her on the porch. "Do you regret exposing him?" she asked gently. Margaret considered the question. "No," she said after a moment. "I regret believing silence was loyalty." The streetlights flickered on. Somewhere beyond the quiet neighborhood, legal machinery continued turning. Daniel had built his second life on the assumption that grief would paralyze the woman he left behind. Instead, it had transformed her. The reckoning was not loud. It was methodical.
And it was not finished.
The trial never became the spectacle reporters anticipated. Daniel pleaded guilty before it reached a courtroom. His attorney negotiated terms in exchange for cooperation in the broader investigation, particularly regarding the unidentified man whose death had been repurposed for escape. Margaret did not attend the plea hearing. She read the summary later at her kitchen table, the same place where months earlier she had studied photographs in disbelief. The language of the document was sterile: intentional misrepresentation, fraudulent transfer of assets, conspiracy to falsify records. It reduced decades of deception to bullet points and paragraphs. Yet it carried weight. The truth was no longer rumor. It was recorded. Daniel received a prison sentence shorter than many expected. His prior record was clean. His cooperation influenced the outcome. Samuel Turner faced financial penalties and probation. The insurance company reclaimed its payout. Assets hidden under the false identity were redistributed according to court orders. Margaret regained legal control over accounts she had once believed were drained beyond recovery. Money returned quietly, without apology. 3 weeks into Daniel's sentence, Margaret received a call from the correctional facility. Daniel had suffered a heart attack during early morning intake procedures and died before medical intervention could stabilize him. The notification was clinical, devoid of sentiment. She listened without interruption. "You are listed as next of kin," the administrator said. "We require instructions regarding remains." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. The irony did not escape her. Twice she was being informed of his death. "Cremation," she replied evenly. "No service." After hanging up, she remained seated for a long time. She expected some emotional surge, rage, sorrow, vindication, but what surfaced instead was distance. The man she had loved had vanished long before his body failed. The second death was not a shock, it was punctuation. Caroline came over that evening. They sat together on the porch where summer air moved gently through the trees. "Are you all right?" Caroline asked quietly. "Yes," Margaret answered, and realized it was true. "I grieved him once already. This time I'm grieving what he chose to become." There was no funeral. No gathering of extended family offering rehearsed condolences. The ashes were released at sea by arrangement with a maritime service. Margaret did not attend. She declined to perform another ritual over a narrative that had already been fractured beyond repair. In the months that followed, life rearranged itself with surprising steadiness. Legal matters concluded methodically. The unidentified man used in the staged accident was finally named through renewed investigation. He had been a terminally ill drifter whose distant relative admitted to accepting money without understanding the scope of the deception. Margaret visited the modest grave where he was eventually reburied under his own name. She placed flowers there, not for Daniel, but for the stranger whose death had been exploited. At home, Margaret began to change her environment in subtle ways. She repainted the bedroom a lighter color, replacing the heavy drapes that had darkened it during mourning. She donated clothing Daniel had left behind. She removed his framed photographs from the hallway, not in anger, but in acknowledgement that memory no longer required display. The house felt less like a museum of grief and more like a structure breathing again. Friends approached cautiously at first, unsure how to address what had become local legend. Margaret refused to indulge drama. When asked how she endured it, she offered a simple answer: "I chose not to stay silent." That sentence traveled farther than any headline. Caroline noticed the shift most clearly. Her mother moved with renewed deliberation, no longer hesitant in decisions she once deferred. She enrolled in a community art class she had postponed for years. She reconnected with an old college friend and planned a short trip abroad. None of it was impulsive. Each action felt like reclaiming territory once surrendered to compromise. One afternoon, nearly a year after the supermarket encounter, Margaret returned alone to the cemetery where Daniel's name had once been carved. The headstone had been removed pending legal correction. The empty patch of earth looked strangely peaceful. She stood there briefly, hands folded before her. "That chapter is closed," she said softly, not to the ground, but to herself. The experience had reshaped her understanding of loyalty. For decades, she had equated endurance with devotion, silence with strength. Daniel had relied on that belief. He had assumed she would absorb betrayal quietly, preserving appearances even in devastation. Instead, she had confronted it. Caroline, reflecting on everything, asked one evening, "Do you think he ever loved you?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "I think he loved the life we built," she replied. "But love without honesty becomes performance." The statement did not carry bitterness. It carried comprehension. Time did not erase what happened, but it reframed it. Margaret no longer replayed the moment in the supermarket with shock. Instead, she saw it as a turning point. The instant illusion cracked. If she had dismissed it as grief-induced hallucination, the lie might have continued indefinitely. Her willingness to trust her own perception had altered the outcome. The financial restitution allowed her security, but money was not the victory. Clarity was. She no longer felt defined by the role of abandoned widow or betrayed spouse. She was simply Margaret, a woman who faced deception and responded with resolve. On a crisp autumn morning, she hosted a small gathering of friends for coffee. Laughter filled the living room, genuine and unguarded. As sunlight filtered through newly chosen curtains, she realized something unexpected. The house no longer felt heavy with absence. It felt occupied by presence, hers. Later that evening, alone with a cup of tea, she reflected on the transformation. Betrayal had fractured her understanding of the past, but it had also clarified the present. She had learned that silence, when imposed by fear or shame, erodes dignity. Speaking truth, even when painful, restores it. Daniel's choices had shaped the narrative for a time, but the ending had not belonged to him. It belonged to her willingness to step beyond grief into action. Margaret rose, turned off the kitchen light, and walked upstairs without hesitation. The bed no longer felt too large. The house no longer echoed. The quiet was no longer emptiness. It was peace earned through confrontation. And in that peace, she finally understood that survival is not merely continuing to breathe after loss. It is reclaiming authorship of your own life when someone else tries to erase you. The silence that once imprisoned her had become something else entirely. It had become freedom.